A leading principle of international relations theory is that the highest priority of states is to ensure security. So a standard formulation by George Kennan, one of the planners of the post-war world, as he put it, is government is created to assure order and justice internally and provide for the common defense, what's called national security. And the proposition seems plausible, almost self-evident, until you begin to look more closely and ask the question, security for whom? For the general population, for state power itself, for dominant domestic constituencies, depending on what we mean. The credibility of the proposition ranges from very high to negligible. So security for state power, for example, is ranked very high. That's illustrated by the great efforts that states exert to protect themselves from their own populations, even from the scrutiny of their populations. Edward Snowden explained his actions by saying that what he said, the public had a right to know about these programs. The public had a right to know that which the government is doing in its name and that which the government is doing against the public. And the same could be justly said by Dan Ellsberg, Chelsea Manning, and other courageous figures who've acted on the same democratic principle. The government stance, of course, is quite different. It's that the public does not have a right to know because security is undermined, severely undermined, so it's asserted. There are several good reasons to be skeptical about a response like that. The first is that it's almost completely predictable. That's what a government says whenever a government act is exposed. It's reflexive. And being predictable, it carries little or no information. A second reason for skepticism is the nature of the evidence presented. It was actually reviewed by well-known international relations scholar John Mearsheimer. He writes that the Obama administration, not surprisingly, initially claimed that the NSA's spying played a key role in thwarting 54 terrorist plots against the United States, implying that it violated the Fourth Amendment for a good reason. This was a lie, however. General Keith Alexander, the NSA director, eventually admitted to Congress that he could claim only one success. That involved catching a Somali immigrant living in San Diego who had sent $8,500 to a terrorist group in Somalia. That's what this huge operation has succeeded in achieving so far. Well, there is a sense in which security is threatened by public awareness, and namely security of state power from exposure. And that's important. The basic insight was expressed very well by distinguished political scientist who held the chair of science of government at Harvard University, Samuel Huntington. He pointed out that the architects of power in the United States must create a force that can be felt but not seen. Power remains strong when it remains in the dark. Exposed to the sunlight, it begins to evaporate. That, incidentally, is in favor of secrecy if you go on with the rest of the discussion. In the U.S. as elsewhere, the architects of power understand this all too well, of course. People who have worked through the huge mass of documents declassified by the government can hardly fail to notice how frequently it is security of state power from the domestic public that's a prime concern, and not national security in any meaningful sense. Often, security is motivated by the need to guarantee the security of powerful domestic sectors. In the United States, that means the corporate sector. One persistent example of this is the mislabeled free trade agreements. They're mislabeled. They're not free trade agreements. They radically violate free trade principles. They're substantially not about trade at all, but rather about investor rights. And they're certainly not agreements, at least if people are part of their countries. People, when they know about them, are usually opposed. These instruments are regularly negotiated in secret, like the current transatlantic, trans-Pacific partnership, huge treaties being negotiated. Not entirely in secret, of course. They're not secret from the hundreds of corporate lobbyists and lawyers who are writing the details of the agreements with an impact that's not too hard to guess, and in fact is revealed by the few parts that have been exposed through WikiLeaks. Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate in economics, reasonably concludes that, as he puts it, with the U.S. Trade Representative's office representing corporate interests, not those of the public, the likelihood that what emerges from the coming talks will serve ordinary Americans' interests is low. The outlook for ordinary citizens in other countries is even bleaker, and the record well supports that, including NAFTA. So security of the secrecy makes sense there, just as in the case of the NSA secrecy. There is real interests that are being secured, but against the population, not of the population. And security of domestic constituencies means the corporate sector. That's a regular concern of government policy, and that's hardly surprising, given their role in formulating the policy in the first place. Examples are too numerous to mention, so I'll skip them. Let's turn to the third interpretation of security, security for the domestic population. In sharp contrast, there's substantial evidence that that kind of security, what's called national security, is just not a high priority for state policy. Well, there are plenty of illustrations. One current one is the global terror campaign that Obama is carrying out, completely unprecedented campaign of global terror, carrying out with great enthusiasm, and in fact the war on terror generally, since it was declared by Ronald Reagan in 1981, redeclared by Bush 20 years later. And more strikingly, it's also true of strategic planning, nuclear policy in particular, to an extent that's not properly recognized. So let's have a look at a few cases. Start with the case of so-called war on terror. So take, for example, the assassination of Osama bin Laden. President Obama, as I'm sure you recall, brought it up with pride in an important speech on national security last May, very widely covered. But there was one crucial paragraph that was ignored. Obama hailed the operation, took credit for it, but he said it cannot be the norm. And the reason, he said, is that the risks were immense. The Navy SEALs, I'm quoting, might have been embroiled in an extended firefight. But by luck, he said, that didn't happen. Nevertheless, the cost to our relationship with Pakistan and the backlash among the Pakistani public over encroachment on their territory, aggression when others do it, was severe. Well, let's add a few details that he didn't mention. The SEALs were under orders to fight their way out if they were apprehended. They would not have been left to their fate if they had been, as Obama put it, embroiled in an extended firefight. The full force of the U.S. military would have been used to extricate them. Pakistan has a powerful military, well-trained, highly protective of state sovereignty, and of course it has nuclear weapons. And Pakistani specialists are quite concerned about penetration of the security system by jihadi elements. Their presence is itself a consequence of the massive terror campaign. It's also no secret that the population of Pakistan has been embittered and radicalized by the drone terror campaign and other U.S. policies, including pressuring the Pakistani military to attack tribal regions that had been left to their own by the British imperialists and their Pakistani successors. While the SEALs were still in the bin Laden compound, Pakistani Chief of Staff Kayani was informed of the invasion, and he ordered his staff, his words, to confront any unidentified aircraft. He assumed they were probably from India. Meanwhile, in Kabul, right down the road, General Petraeus ordered U.S. warplanes to respond if Pakistanis scrambled their fighter jets. Well, as Obama said, the worst didn't happen by luck, and it could have been quite ugly, could have been nuclear war. But the risks were faced without noticeable concern or subsequent comment, which is also interesting. Well, there's a lot more to say about that operation, and it's actually quite immense cost to Pakistan. But instead, let's look more closely at the concern for security more generally, beginning with security from terror, then turning to the much more important question of security from instant destruction by nuclear weapons. So Obama's global assassination campaign, as I said, by far the world's worst terrorist campaign, never been anything like it. It's also a terror-generating campaign, and that's well understood at the highest levels. So, for example, General McChrystal, former head of U.S. forces in Afghanistan after Iraq, he pointed out that for every innocent person you kill, you create 10 new enemies. Actually, the concept of innocent person, which is now standard in U.S. discourse, it tells you how far we've progressed in the last 800 years. Next year is the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, which established the principle of presumption of innocence. A person's innocent until proven guilty in a proper trial with a jury of peers. Now, that was the foundation of Anglo-American law, but that's ancient history. By now, the word guilty has a different meaning. It means targeted for assassination by President Obama. And the word innocent means not yet accorded that status, though he might be next Tuesday in the president's assassination meetings. A couple of days after the Boston Marathon bombing, Obama ordered an assassination in a remote Yemeni village. Actually, we rarely learn about such crimes, but it happened that there was a young man from the village in the United States, and he testified about the operation before a Senate committee. He reported that for years, jihadis had been trying to turn the villagers against the United States, but they had failed. The villagers knew nothing about the United States except what he was writing about it, and he liked the United States. But he said one drone murder in the village, actually a murder of a person who could easily have been apprehended, one drone murder vindicated jihadi propaganda, turned the whole village into people who hate America and want to retaliate against it, once again swelling the ranks of the terrorist networks that have proliferated under the war on terror. They're now all over large parts of the world and deeply motivated for revenge, not surprisingly. You can act how we would react under similar circumstances. Well, meanwhile, we're developing the technology to facilitate terror targeting ourselves. There's an article in Britain's leading journal of international affairs, David Hastings Dunn, a recent article. He outlines how the increasingly sophisticated drones that we're developing are a perfect weapon for terrorist groups. As he puts it, they're cheap, easily acquired, and in general possess many qualities which, when combined, make them potentially the ideal means for terrorist attack in the 21st century. He says you can already buy a small drone on the internet for a couple $100, and they're getting much more sophisticated. Perfect terrorist weapons. We're developing them, and every possibility that we'll be the victims. But that's not a concern, because that has to do with defense security of the population, which is not a particular interest of states. Senator Adlai Stevenson III, he was referring to his many years of service in the Senate Intelligence Committee, he wrote that cyber surveillance and metadata collection are part of the continuing reaction to 9/11, with few, if any, terrorists to show for it, and near universal condemnation. The United States is widely perceived as waging war against Islam, against Shias as well as Sunnis, on the ground, with drones, by proxy in Palestine, from the Persian Gulf to Central Asia. Germany and Brazil resent our intrusions, and what have they wrought? Well, the answer is that they've wrought a growing threat of terror, as well as international isolation. Stevenson is quite correct about near universal condemnation. The former CIA chief, Michael Hayden, recently conceded, as he put it, that right now there isn't a government on the planet that agrees with our legal rationale for these operations, except for Afghanistan and maybe Israel. And he's probably wrong about Afghanistan. Hayden's conclusions are reflected in an international poll that was just released by major polling agencies in England and the United States, Gallup in the United States. It was released in December, and one of the questions was, which country do you think is the greatest threat to peace in the world today? And guess who was first? The United States was far in the lead. Nobody else was even close. Second place, Pakistan had 1/3 the votes of the United States, and that was inflated by the Indian vote. Other countries were way down. World opinion of Iran was very low. World opinion sharply rejects the domestic obsession that Iran poses the greatest threat to world peace, and in fact it is an obsession shared almost nowhere else. That poll was not reported in the mainstream media in the United States. We're not supposed to know things like that. It's not important. What Americans are supposed to believe, to quote President Obama, is that for generations, the United States of America has played a unique role as an anchor of global security and as an advocate of human freedom. That's what we're supposed to believe, not what the world thinks. We don't know about that. Actually, Obama produced this declaration while his bombs were raining on Libya in violation of a UN Security Council resolution 1973 that the United States, Britain, and France had forced through. It called for an immediate ceasefire, negotiations, and actions to protect civilians, including the civilians in the areas that were reduced to the level of Grozny after Russian attack by NATO bombs, according to on-the-scene reports from the Western press, not the U.S. press, Britain, other countries. And if most of the world sharply disagrees with the preferred self-image, we can cheerfully ignore them or condemn them for their backwardness, not understanding our magnificence. There are historical precedents for that, and they're not particularly attractive. There's also virtually no acknowledgement of the extensive polling by Western agencies, U.S. and other Western agencies, in the Arab world, with very interesting results. What it shows is that Iran is disliked, but it's just not regarded as a threat. Overwhelmingly, they rank the United States and Israel as the major threats they face. Now, in this case, Americans are supposed to believe that the Arabs support the U.S. stand on Iran. That's what's reported constantly. But what's not mentioned is that they're reporting the attitudes of the dictators, not the population. Standard practice is to restrict attention to friendly dictators, ignoring populations. That reflects the dominant concern for democracy and for people generally. Well, let's go on to nuclear weapons, a much more important matter. Even instant destruction by nuclear weapons has never ranked high among the concerns of state authorities. It's a very ample record on that. I'll sample a little bit of it, starting in the early days of the atomic age. Remember, in the early days, say around 1950, the U.S. was overwhelmingly powerful. It enjoyed remarkable security. It controlled the hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans. There was one potential threat not yet developed on the horizon. That was ICBMs with nuclear warheads. There's a comprehensive review of nuclear policy by McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson. He had access to the highest level sources, and he has some interesting comments. He writes, I'll quote him, "The timely development of ballistic missiles during the Eisenhower administration is one of the best achievements of those 8 years. Yet it is well to begin with a recognition that both the United States and the Soviet Union might be in much less nuclear danger today if those missiles had never been developed." And then he adds an instructive comment. He says, "I am aware of no serious contemporary proposal, in or out of government, that missiles should somehow be banned by agreement." In short, there was apparently no thought, no discussion, but not even thought of trying to prevent the sole serious threat to the United States, the threat of utter destruction. It just had zero significance, not even a staff paper discussing it. Well, could it have been prevented? Can't be sure, of course. The Russians were way behind in technology, knew it. It's conceivable that they might have considered such an agreement. And in fact, there are indications that that was true. But in the quite extraordinary hysteria of those days, they couldn't even be perceived. So one suggestive indication of possible opportunities is a remarkable proposal that Joseph Stalin made in 1952. He offered to allow Germany to be unified with internationally supervised free elections on one condition, that it not join a hostile military alliance. And that's hardly an extreme condition in the light of the history of the past half century, which I don't have to review to you. Well, Stalin's proposal was taken seriously by one respected political commentator, James Warburg, but apart from him, it seems to have been entirely ignored or ridiculed. Recent scholarship has begun to take a different view. One well-known Soviet scholar, Adam Ulam, bitterly anti-communist, he writes recently that the status of Stalin's proposal is an unresolved mystery. Washington wasted little effort in flatly rejecting Moscow's initiative on grounds that were embarrassingly unconvincing, leaving open the basic question: was Stalin ready to sacrifice the newly created German Democratic Republic, East Germany, on the altar of real democracy, with consequences for American peace and American security that could have been enormous? That's a mystery. It was ridiculed, dismissed, not discussed. One of the most prominent Cold War scholars, Melvin Leffler, reviewing the recent research in the Soviet archives that have been coming out. He points out that many scholars were surprised to discover that Lavrenti Beria, the sinister, brutal head of the secret police, proposed that the Kremlin offer the West a deal on the unification and neutralization of Germany, agreeing to sacrifice the East German communist regime to reduce East-West tensions and improve internal political and economic conditions in Russia. Opportunities that were squandered, in fact, not even discussed. in favor of securing German participation in NATO. Under the circumstances, going back to the early 50s, it's not at all impossible that agreements could have been reached that would have protected the security of the population of the United States from the gravest threat on the horizon, the threat of total instant destruction. But the possibility apparently was not even considered. It's another indication of how slight a role authentic security plays in state policy. I should add that none of this is discussed in scholarship either. The two quotes that I mentioned are rare. It's just disregarded. If state authorities didn't care at all about instant destruction of the population, what interest is there in that? Let's go on to the next topic. Meanwhile, repeating the mantra of international relations theory that security, national security, is the highest goal of state policy. Well, this was revealed again in the years that followed. After Stalin's death, 1953, Nikita Khrushchev took over, and he very quickly recognized that Russia could not compete militarily with the United States, the richest, most powerful country in world history, and comparable advantages. And he understood that if Russia wanted to escape its economic backwardness and, of course, the devastating effect of the war, it would be necessary to reverse the arms race. And he took steps in that direction. He proposed sharp mutual reductions in offensive weapons. The incoming Kennedy administration considered the offer and rejected it, instead turning to rapid military expansion. Actually, that continued even when Khrushchev unilaterally reduced offensive weapons. One of the leading international relations scholars, Kenneth Waltz, died recently, supported by other strategic analysts with close connections with U.S. intelligence. He wrote that the Kennedy administration undertook the largest strategic and conventional peacetime military buildup the world has yet seen, even as Khrushchev was trying at once to carry through a major reduction in the conventional forces and to follow a strategy of minimum deterrence. And we did so even though the balance of strategic weapons greatly favored the United States. Again, it severely harmed national security, but it enhanced state power. Well, there was a Soviet reaction. It was placing missiles in Cuba in October 1962 to try to redress the great imbalance. And it was also motivated by something else. We don't talk about it much here, but Kennedy was carrying out a major terrorist war against Cuba. It wasn't a joke. It was a serious terrorist war run by his brother, Robert Kennedy, for whom it was the highest priority. And that terrorist war was scheduled to lead to an invasion in October 1962. That's when the missiles went in. Well, that brought the world to what Arthur Schlesinger, Kennedy's associate, called the most dangerous moment in history. That month, late October, the crisis peaked. On October 26th, Kennedy received a secret letter from Khrushchev offering to end the crisis by simultaneous public withdrawal of Russian missiles from Cuba and U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey, right on Russia's border. The Turkish missile, Kennedy was surprised. He didn't know we had missiles there. They were obsolete missiles, and a withdrawal order had already been sent for them. And the reason was they were being replaced by much more lethal Polaris submarines than invulnerable. Well, that's what was going on at the most dangerous moment in history. At that point, Kennedy's own subjective estimate of the probability of nuclear war was 1/3 to 1/2. That was a war that would have destroyed the Northern Hemisphere, as President Eisenhower put it. Kennedy refused. I think that must be one of the most horrendous decisions in history. And worse yet, he's greatly praised for his cool courage and statesmanship. I think that's worth reflection. Well, 10 years after that, Henry Kissinger called a nuclear alert. It was the last days of the 1973 Israel-Arab War. It was a purpose. The purpose was to warn the Russians not to interfere with his delicate diplomatic maneuvers. They were designed to ensure an Israeli victory, but a limited victory, so that the United States would remain in control of the region unilaterally. And the maneuvers were delicate. The U.S. and Russia had jointly imposed a ceasefire, but Kissinger secretly informed Israel that they could ignore it. Hence, a need for a nuclear alert to frighten the Russians away so that these delicate maneuvers couldn't continue. Luckily, once again, the Russians backed down, but security of the population had its usual status, namely zero. It wasn't even a concern. 10 years after that, the Reagan administration launched operations to probe Russian air defenses. They simulated air and naval attacks, actually air attacks right into Russian territory, and naval attacks, and they gave a warning of a very high level, actually DEFCON 1 nuclear alert. All of this happened at a very tense moment. Pershing II missiles were being deployed in Europe. They had several minutes flight time to Moscow. Reagan had just announced the SDI program, so-called Star Wars program, which the Russians understood to be a first strike weapon. That's how missile defense is understood on both sides, standard interpretation. And other tensions were rising. Well, naturally, all of this aroused great alarm in Russia. Unlike the United States, Russia is quite vulnerable. The U.S. is invulnerable, but not the Russians. They've been repeatedly invaded and virtually destroyed. Actually, that led to a major war scare in 1983. Was recognized to have been serious, but there are newly released archives which reveal that the danger was even more severe than historians had assumed. There's a recent CIA study which is entitled, "The War Scare Was for Real." It concludes that U.S. intelligence underestimated Russian concerns and the threat of a Russian preventative nuclear strike. There's a recent article in the Journal of Strategic Studies which concludes the Reagan exercises almost became a prelude to a preventative nuclear strike. Actually, it was even more dangerous than this. We learned that last September from a report in the BBC, reported that right in the midst of these world-threatening developments, Russia's early warning systems detected an incoming missile strike from the United States, and they sent the highest level alert. Now, there's a protocol for the Soviet military to retaliate with a nuclear attack of its own. There's an officer, a person who has to transmit the reports to the higher level, officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov. He just decided not to transmit the warnings, disobey orders, highest imaginable disobedience of orders. He didn't transmit the warnings. He received an official reprimand, and thanks to his dereliction of duty, we're here to talk about it. Security of the it's not the only case. Security of the population was no more a high priority for Reagan planners than for their predecessors, or and it continues up till the present. I gave one example before, but there are plenty of others. And it continues even, I'm putting aside examples like the Petrov case, near catastrophic accidents. They happen all the time. We don't have a full Russian record, but a fairly extensive American record, and it's appalling. Actually, a chilling new book on it, but by Eric Schlosser, if you want to know some of the details. It's very hard to contest the conclusion of the previous commander of the General Lee Butler, who said that the fact that we have so far survived the nuclear age is a matter of some combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention, and I suspect the latter in greatest proportion. General Butler went on to describe the U.S. strategic plan of 1960, calling for automated all-out strikes, as in his words, the single most absurd and irresponsible document I have ever reviewed in my life. He says, with the possible exception of its probable Soviet counterpart, which we don't know about. But there are competitors like the regular, easy acceptance of threats to survival that are almost too extraordinary to capture in words, like the kinds I've indicated. But the words are there, and they're worth reading. Start with the near hysterical rhetoric, ravings actually, of NSC 68. Many of you know that's the major early post-war document. And its content have been described, but not its rhetoric. And it's worth reading. It reads like an insane ravings of absolute lunatics. You should read it to see. If you think it's an exaggeration, you should read it. And right to the present. The words are also there in high-level documents that outline the U.S. strategic doctrine. And there's one example, which in the Clinton years came out at an important time. It's a document of STRATCOM, the Strategic Command, which is in charge of nuclear weapons. It's called Essentials of Post-Cold War Deterrence. This is a high-level document right after the end of the Cold War, several years after the Soviet Union collapsed. Actually, it was also after the United States had begun to expand NATO to the east in direct violation of promises to Gorbachev when he agreed to the unification of Germany within NATO. Actually, that's a matter that's on the front pages today in connection with Ukraine. An extremely serious danger. Of course, for expanding NATO to the borders of Russia is no small matter for them, apart from the promise to Gorbachev not to do it. Well, let's go back to the STRATCOM document. It's concerned, I'll mostly quote it, it's concerned with the role of nuclear weapons in the post-Cold War era. And one central conclusion is that the U.S. must maintain the right of first strike, even against non-nuclear states. Furthermore, nuclear weapons must always be available because they cast a shadow over any crisis or conflict. So they're constantly used, just as you're using a gun. If you go in to rob a store and you aim it, but you don't fire it. It's a point that Dan Ellsberg has repeatedly stressed. It's a mistake to say that the weapons aren't used. They're always used. And STRATCOM goes on to advise that planners should not be too rational about determining what the opponent values most, all of which must be targeted. It hurts to portray ourselves as too fully rational and cool-headed, that the United States might become irrational and vindictive should be a part of the national persona that we project. It's beneficial for our strategic posture if some elements may appear to be potentially out of control and thus posing a constant threat of nuclear attack. That's the document about post-Cold War deterrence. Nothing here about Kennan's order justice of the common defense, or for that matter about the obligation under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to make good faith efforts to eliminate this scourge of the earth. And plans for the future are not very promising. The Congressional Budget Office reported in December that the U.S. nuclear arsenal will cost $350 billion over the next decade, and then costs of modernization will quadruple from 2024 to 2030. There's a study of the Monterey Institute of International Studies estimated that the U.S. would spend $1 trillion on the nuclear arsenal in the next 30 years, a percentage of the military budget comparable to spending for procurement of new strategic systems in the 1980s under President Ronald Reagan. And of course, the United States is not alone. As General Butler observed, it's a near miracle that we've escaped destruction so far, and the longer we continue to tempt fate, the less likely it is that we can hope for divine intervention to save us from our folly. Well, in the case of nuclear weapons, at least we know in principle how to overcome the threatening catastrophe. It can be done. But there's another dire peril that casts its shadow over any contemplation of the future. That's, of course, environmental disaster. And here it's not so clear that there even is an escape, though it is clear that the longer we delay, the more severe the threat becomes, and not in the distant future. So the commitment of governments to the security of their population is very clearly exhibited by how they address this issue, the issue of destruction of the possibility for decent existence for your grandchildren. Well, there's a lot of exuberance in the United States right now about what's called 100 years of energy independence, as we become the Saudi Arabia of the next century, very likely the final century of human civilization if current policies persist. And you might take a speech of President Obama's to be a pretty eloquent death knell for the species. He proclaimed with pride, to ample applause, I'll read his words, "And now under my administration, America is producing more oil today than at any time in the preceding 8 years. And that's important to know. Over the last 3 years, I've directed my administration to open up millions of acres for gas and oil exploration across 23 different states. We're opening up more than 75% of our potential oil resources offshore. We've quadrupled the number of operating rigs to a record high. We've added enough new oil and gas pipeline to encircle the earth and then some." That's our president. And the applause also tells us something about government commitment to security. He was giving this talk in Cushing, Oklahoma. It's an oil town, actually the oil town. It's described as the most significant trading hub for crude oil in North America. And industry profits are sure to be secured as producing more oil and gas here at home will continue to be a critical part of energy society strategy, as the president promised, and as we happily march toward the precipice like the proverbial lemmings. Well, let me summarize finally. There is a sense in which security is a high priority for government planners, security for the state, and that means security against its population, security for the primary constituency, concentrated corporate power. All of that entails that policy must be protected from public scrutiny. Except those terms, everything falls into place as quite rational, even the rationality of collective suicide, which is exactly the logic that we're pursuing. Of course, that's if the general public permits all of this to continue. That's always the fundamental question. Thanks.